George Galloway for كلمة on الميادين television, coming to you from London. I'm George Galloway, presenting كلمة where every word is free. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on الميادين television, coming to you from London town. It's London calling, and we're going to be talking about British Muslims, their history, their achievements, their problems, and indeed the dangers that they face. First of all, we need to get some perspective. The Muslim Council of Britain, just last week in a parliamentary report, the launch of which I attended, identified that from the latest census, there are 2.7 million Muslims in Britain, by the grace of God, and that figure has increased by 1 million in the last 10 years. That increase is explained partly by a new settlement of Muslims who have come mainly from areas under bombardment by Britain and its allies, otherwise known as the areas of war and occupation, but also some other Muslim immigration from Europe, from places like Kosovo and other such countries formerly in the socialist bloc. The figure of 2.7 million caused a great tremor in right-wing circles and seemed momentarily to buttress the point that Muslims were growing in Britain at such a rate as to be threatening to take over, until you realize that Britain has a population of 65 million. So 2.7 million, though a substantial number, is nowhere near taking over anything. And even if the fecundity of Muslim families were to be maintained over the next 50 years, by which I mean their rate of growth, natural growth through childbirth, that's never going to happen in 100 years, 200 years, 500 years. There'd have to be a lot of conversions if the majority of Britain was ever going to be Muslim. But 2.7 million is enough to command respect, or ought to be. It ought to be enough to establish a niche in the British power structures, but it hasn't so far. If we compare with just one other group, the Jewish community in Britain is 250,000 strong. The Muslim community in Britain is therefore more than 10 times larger. But there is no doubt which of these two communities has garnered the greater respect and garnered a foothold in the political and other structures in Britain, which is very impressive indeed. Now, some Muslims decry the respect, indeed power, that the Jewish community in Britain has achieved. I'm not one of those. I take my hat off, metaphorically, to them. It is a fantastic achievement of the Jewish community in Britain that with 250,000 people, they have commanded so many important positions in the state, which they do almost invariably extremely well. So, I don't want the British Muslims to decry British Jews. I want them to emulate British Jews. I want them to organize like British Jews have organized. I want them to achieve like the British Jewish community has achieved. So let's look at British Jews, not with any feeling of ill will, but with admiration and respect and that most sincere form of flattery, imitation. Now, British Muslims are undoubtedly under great pressure. They were under great pressure before 9/11, but since 9/11 that has been a pressure which has vaulted and become very much more serious, in some cases more dangerous. It's become more dangerous still since the massacre we talked about on a recent program in Paris at the Charlie Hebdo newspaper offices and in the Jewish supermarket elsewhere in Paris. This has been followed by other attacks in Europe, firefights, gunfights in Belgium, the murder of a man outside a synagogue in Copenhagen, and the attempted murder of many others at a meeting immediately beforehand. There is undoubtedly a fear and loathing of Muslims in the West, and Britain is definitely no exception. Of course, there's very little understanding of the role that Britain and its allies have played in inflating Islamic extremism. There's very little understanding that one of the reasons why more Muslims have become more fanatical and dangerous is because of Western policies towards the Muslim world. There's very little understanding of Islam and Muslims in general. And yet, there are many Muslims in Britain who have achieved very great distinction, and some who undoubtedly will. I see in the audience a young friend of mine, Irfan, who's attending one of Britain's very best and most expensive public schools, and I have no doubt whatsoever that he's going to be an outstanding success in life. And many Muslims have now so become. Some like Sam Abdullah, the head of one of London's great hospitals. There are surgeons, there are people at the very top in many parts of British society who are Muslims. However, the majority of British Muslims are not such high achievers. They live in greater proportion than any other section of the community in substandard housing, in areas of multiple deprivation. They live overwhelmingly in the inner city, which once upon a time would have been a great thing, but nowadays is not. They are more likely to be unemployed. Their women folk are far more likely to be unemployed. Their elderly people are likely to suffer poorer health than any other section of the community. And that's before you throw in the bigotry, discrimination, and hatred. We live in a country where there is an unremitting diet of hatred and fear of Muslims. In the popular press, scarcely a day goes by, indeed, probably never a day goes by, without some Muslim scare story or other. And of course, as we said at the time of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, if you pump the airwaves full of hatred of Muslim leaders, Muslim countries, well, it's asking more than is likely to be achieved to imagine that your population are going to make a distinction between the Muslim leader over there that you're supposed to hate and the Muslim who runs a shop on your street corner or a restaurant down the high street. We said at the time in 2002, 2003, that if you make war against Muslims abroad, you're going to inevitably be at war with Muslims at home. And this has proved correct. On 7/7, 2005, fanatic terrorist maniacs blew up London Underground trains and a London bus, murdering 55 people and maiming hundreds of others. And according to the British security services and the police and the political class, we're just waiting for a Paris-style atrocity to be visited upon us here in Britain. And if that were to happen, then every problem I have just been describing will get worse and not better. But the Muslims have been here for more than 100 years, and they're not going to go away. Mosques proliferate. The population, as I've said, has increased by 1 million in just the last 10 years. In my own parliamentary constituency of Bradford West, almost 40% of the voters there are Muslims, something like 38%. And there are many great cities in England with great Muslim populations. who are making their impact on politics as well as on other forms of social life. So we're looking tonight at the British Muslims. What have they achieved? Where are they going? Where are they headed? And what are their significant problems? And I have assembled here an audience of experts, as well as the odd gifted amateur like me. I'll be back with the debate after this. You're watching كلمة on الميادين television with me, George Galloway, here in London. We're talking about British Muslims, and our audience throughout the Arab world will be mighty interested in hearing what I, and especially what my audience, which has mustered here in London, have to say. Who's going to make the first contribution? Yes, sir, please.
My name's Abdul Malik Taylor. I've been Muslim for 22 years, and I used to be a former practicing Hindu, so I'm a convert to Islam. And about 2 years ago, we set up Muslim history tours, where we would take Londoners or international people who visit the country around London to look at some of the connections, contributions and presence of Muslim history within London. But this is, as opposed to having a book, this is an outdoor experience where we actually take them to Parliament Square.
You must take me on that tour.
That's for definite. I'll take you up on that. And
Trafalgar Square, now, of course, Trafalgar Square is called after Tarif al-Ghar.
That's correct.
An Arabic word from the Andalusian days, and where Nelson won a famous battle, which British people think was called Trafalgar. In fact, it was called Tarif al-Ghar. Okay, go on.
That's absolutely correct. Even what you find on the top of Nelson's column is that Nelson himself has been given an award by the Ottomans as well. And any form of uniform that you see him in or portrait, he's always got the Muslim crescent there. And not a lot of people have actually realised that.
I did not myself. Tell us more about the tour. What do you show them?
Yeah, we show them basically different buildings. We would also show them Westminster School as well. They were teaching Arabic there about 400 years ago. So we actually showed them actual examples, what were the students learning. We also show where Old New Scotland Yard was, and what did a so-called famous former police commissioner actually steal from some Muslims as well. Back in when he was stationed in India, he had some Indian Muslim police inspectors, and he would actually they actually came up with the idea of fingerprinting and how to actually classify it. And Calcutta was the first place where you had the first fingerprint bureau in the world. It wasn't like New York, Miami, or Las Vegas, as you might think in CSI or something like that. But like he borrowed the idea, or as we like to say sometimes, stole the idea, brought it back to London and gave presentations to it. Spoke to the Home Secretary about it, wrote a book about it, and he was given the credit. So this was a history which was basically taken, which wasn't actually originally his. Then we also look at...
Well, the British are good at that, of course. We've stolen things all over the world, and including parts of the world. And of course the crown jewels themselves, the jewel within the crown jewels, the Kohinoor diamond, the world's most expensive diamond, was of course stolen from the Mughals in India when Britain arrived. And there's no intention, I think, to give it back. Let me just add something to your tour, unless you've already got onto it. Recent correspondence has shown that Winston Churchill, the greatest of all the British, that his family were extremely concerned that he was about to convert to Islam. And this caused them all to write to Mr. Churchill, asking that he should not do so. It's a very interesting twist to the Churchill story.
No, it is, that's for definite, that's for definite.
Thank you for kicking us off with that, making the point. They were teaching Arabic in Westminster School. That's one of the most expensive and most selective private schools in all of Britain. Most of our rulers were educated there, as well as one or two heroes like the late and great Tony Benn. Now, who'd like to come in next? Yes, madam.
Hello. I want to ask about the vote the Telegraph posted. Do you fear the presence from the presence of a British Muslim? So if somebody commit a crime other than Muslim, they say this is lunatics, just one person. But when Muslims are doing so over, not in Britain, they come to all the Muslim all around the world, not just in Britain. So why do we have to face that here, despite being loyal to this country and we respect all its rules?
Well, the lady's asking about one of the biggest and most long-established British newspapers called the Daily Telegraph, which is running a poll right now asking people if they fear the fact that, according to this report, there are now 2.7 million Muslims in Britain. Can you just imagine if a newspaper, a reputable newspaper, a great historic newspaper, ran such a poll about any other section of the British population? Would they run a poll saying, are you afraid of the number of black people in Britain, or the number of Catholics in Britain, or the number of Jews in Britain? It's inconceivable that they would even dream of running such a poll. And if they did, they would be subject to relentless scandal. But this is the kind of atmosphere which, of course, is not just deeply offensive to people like you, who you say respect and the country and loyal to it and so on. It's deeply offensive, of course, but it's also deeply radicalizing, fanaticizing, extremizing. After all, if you are a Muslim in Britain and all around you is a wall of sound and fury against your people and your faith, well, for a proportion at least, that's going to make you pretty radical. It's going to make you pretty angry. And from amongst the ranks of the radical and the angry come some of these fanatics who carry out the very acts which the Telegraph is encouraging people to be afraid of in the first place. It's a very grim piece of geometry, that one. Who's next? Yes, madam, in the third row.
Good evening, George. My name is Lisa. I come from Germany, where there's a great problem at the moment with Islamophobia, Pegida, and my daughter lives here in London with my grandchildren who are very, very small, and I'd like to know if it's going to be a safe place to live, or do you think, in your opinion, that something like Pegida could happen here?
Well, it is happening here on Saturday the 28th, I think, 27th or 28th of February. I'm attending a rally in Newcastle, which is a counter-demonstration to the very first Pegida demonstration in England. Now, I believe that our counter-demonstration will be very, very much larger than the anti-Muslim demonstration which has been imported from Germany. But then in Dresden, the Pegida demonstrations in the beginning were extremely small, and then they became extremely large. And as is the way with these far-right organizations, it has now exploded or imploded and is broken into pieces because, of course, in this digital age, it didn't take long for someone to come up with a photograph of the leader of Pegida, done up like Adolf Hitler, dressed like Hitler, with his hair combed like Hitler, and a fake toothbrush moustache like Hitler, which of course knocked the legs from the argument that they were somehow concerned Christians.
Yeah, he was also, he's been arrested by the police apparently for drug dealing as well, so.
Yes,
yeah.
I mean, most of the leaders of the far right in Britain, and indeed elsewhere, are low-life characters, criminals, former criminals, drug dealers, deviants of many different kinds. And this is quickly found out now, much more quickly than ever before. But I feel very sad that you needed to ask the first part of your question, and you did need to ask it. But I'm very sad that you had the need of it. I was once campaigning, Irfan, in your part of the city in Walthamstow, in fact, some years ago now, almost 10 years ago, imagine, after 9/11, but almost 10 years ago, I was asked by a young man if his children were going to be safe growing up in England. Would Britain become like Bosnia? And I remember the heartache I felt as I ruminated on that question afterwards. The best way I can put it is this: there are dangers for Muslims in Britain, but there are more dangers in other places. The old saw is, if you think Britain's racist, you've never lived in France. I think that France is far, far more dangerous for Muslims and for other immigrants, for that matter. But that's not to say that Britain does not have some dangers. Of course, no one can look into a crystal ball and predict with any exactitude these answers. But my belief in my own country, in my own people rather than country — I'm not really a big believer in countries, but my belief in my own people is that extremism and hatred is the prerogative of a minority. It's not a small minority, I'm not going to lie to you. We're not talking about 20,000 people who hate Muslims in this country. We're probably talking in excess of 1 million. And that million contains some people who are very dangerous. And in Britain, Islamic hatred of Islam, Islamophobia as we call it, has become the last respectable form of racism. People, rich people, educated people, civilized people, people who consider themselves to be liberal, will sit around a dinner table trashing Muslims and trashing Islam in a way that they never would dream of doing about any other group in society. And indeed, they'd pride themselves on the fact that they would never do so. So I suppose I'm saying there are dangers. They're not extreme, those dangers. They're not as bad as the dangers that exist elsewhere. I hope I'm not fooling myself, but I have enough faith in my own people to believe that your grandchildren will always be safe here, by the grace of God. Yes, sir.
Do you think the media here must bear some responsibility about this, all this Islamophobia?
The media
like
must...
the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, right? Talking
yes, the media must take a very considerable part of the blame, but the media is merely an echo chamber for the political class. The reason that the media is filled with Islamic hatred is because the state encouraged them to be full of hatred of Muslims over there. The state didn't say, turn up the heat on Muhammad who runs the street corner shop. Indeed, they've got a problem about the heat that's being directed at Muhammad who runs the corner shop. But when the airwaves were filled with hatred of one Arab dictator or another, filled with hatred of distorted, caricatured view of Islamic societies here and there, it was an inevitable concomitant that that hatred would begin to turn against Muhammad who runs the corner shop. So right-wing politicians, of whom we have many, again, not as right-wing as France and some other places, but right-wing nonetheless, right-wing conservatives, UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which for those overseas I'll explain is a party campaigning to take Britain out of the European Union, other much smaller far-right groups, the so-called English Defence League, Britain First, and a variety of fascist organizations. They're using anti-Muslim hatred for political purposes. Some of them don't even really hate Muslims. Some of them don't even really hate foreigners, but they know there's votes in that. They know that you can get political support, maybe even power, through that. So you have an unholy alliance between the political class and its media echo chamber. They would like this to go far, but not too far, just far enough. The danger is, it's, as I often say in another context, it's a Frankenstein monster that you're making. And the whole point of Frankenstein's monster is that when it became a monster, you were no longer in control of it. And it might even turn and devour you yourself. We're discussing Muslims in Britain, here in Britain, in London. This is Kalimahoorra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Miadeen television, and we'll be right back. You're watching Kalimahoorra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Miadeen television, coming to you from London, discussing British Muslims, their problems, their achievements, who's to blame for the problems, how we could get more achievements. This all in the wake of a Muslim Council of Britain survey drawn from the latest official census, which shows that the British Muslim population has now reached 2.7 million, which is enough to form a critical mass to make some significant advance. But we haven't yet seen that advance. Let's take some more contributors from the audience. Yes, sir.
Oh, hi. In light of the anti-Islamic narrative in the media and among people on social media as well, what do you think the Muslim response should be, and what are you yourself doing?
Well, the Muslim response should be to organize. I'll give you some personal examples. I recently went to BBC Question Time, which is the flagship political program on the BBC. It took place in the London borough of Barnet. There's a 16% Jewish population in the London borough of Barnet, but there's a 14.5% Muslim population in that borough. A very significant number of extremely zealous, indeed aggressive, Jewish people from the borough applied to BBC Question Time to be in the audience. It would appear that not many Muslims applied to be in the audience. When a journalist puts his finger over the key to write something critical of Israel, he knows that as soon as the words he writes are published, there will be an avalanche of criticism, complaints, demands for his sacking, and so on. No journalist fears writing anything bad about the Muslims because, as I was indicating earlier, in this case, Jewish supporters of Zionism, and of course not all Jews support Zionism, and most Zionists are not Jews, but that's another matter. They're organized. They know what to do, and they're prepared to do it. And whatever differences or divisions there are amongst them are all sublimated to the goal of defending Israel. No such unity exists in the Muslim community. The number of members of the conservative Friends of Israel, the Labour Friends of Israel, and the Liberal Democrat Friends of Israel are very, very large. Indeed, you have no chance of advance in British government unless you are a member of the Friends of Israel. It's not actually because the members of Parliament really, really love Israel. It's because those who do love Israel have organized themselves to bring such pressure to bear that an ambitious politician with no principles, and there's a few of those, feels that they must join the Friends of Israel. No such pressure exists. None. No such pressure exists from the other point of view. Even though there's 10 times more Muslims in Britain than there are Jews, and many of the Jews don't support Israel. So you see the point that I'm making. It's about confidence. It's about organization. Now, maybe the Muslims in Britain, most of them, just haven't been here long enough. I'll give you a second example. The mayor of London is elected with 1 million votes. London had Ken Livingstone as the mayor of London. He was the greatest champion of the Muslims that you could possibly imagine. But he was voted out. And all he needed was 1 million votes. How many Muslims do you think there are in London? 1 million. Even if nobody else had voted for Ken Livingstone, if all the Muslims had voted for him, he'd still be the mayor, instead of bonkers Boris Johnson, who is a rampant Zionist who frequently gives a push to anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment in the city and in the country. Is that not a salutary story? Nobody could have done more than Livingstone as the mayor. He even invited and kissed Qaradawi. I wouldn't have done that myself, but Livingstone did. What did he get in return? He got an onslaught of propaganda attacks, and he didn't even get the votes of the Muslims, most of whom stayed at home and didn't vote at all. Get my point? Irfan.
Could you elaborate further on why there is this lack of political consciousness, and how do we get to that stage? Is it because of a lack of knowledge of the systems, a lack of priority, or is it indeed because there are other subvertive factors at play?
Well, of course it would take me a long time to adumbrate them all, but the principal ones are this. It's a lack of confidence, which is partly understandable. People feel under pressure. They put their heads above the parapet. Someone might take a metaphorical shot at them. It's about a lack of political consciousness, especially amongst the largest component of Britain's Muslims, many of whom are trapped in a folk memory of 50 years ago from their village in Mirpur or Pakistan, who are into Baradarism, which is a form of tribalism, unknown in the Arab world really, but quite prevalent in the South Asian Muslim community, where what counts is not the politics of the person who's up for the election, but whether their grandfather lived in the same village as your grandfather 50 years ago back in Kashmir or in the Punjab. But it's also, I'm sorry to say, you may not all agree with me, there is a preoccupation amongst Muslims everywhere, but in Britain too, with form rather than content. I'm a member, for example, of a WhatsApp group with hundreds of Muslims on it. It's called Muslim Brothers United. You'll get far, far more debate on what's the proper length of a beard, on what's the proper length of trousers, when a dupatta becomes a hijab, whether women need to wear either, and so on. You'll get far more debate on this question than you will on the political questions that I'm discussing now. Come back.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you say. But is this not a colonial era issue where the striving for self-perfection was a reaction to people occupying other aspects of society? And it's not always been as petty as this, because human life was the most important goal for any Muslim at one point. How do we overcome this? How do we?
Well, it's beyond me to overcome it. It's a trend within Muslim society everywhere, but I can judge its effects here. And I know that, well, let me give you an example, as this is an Arab television station. On February the 15th, 2003, I, with 2 million others, stood all day in the bitter, icy cold of Hyde Park demonstrating against the then imminent invasion and occupation of Iraq. There were many Muslims on the demonstration, but most of the people were not Muslims. Chilled to the bone, we walked up Edgware Road in London and went into a restaurant run by a man that I knew well from his days as a revolutionary with a gun in Lebanon in the 1970s. It was very warm inside the restaurant, not least because it was completely packed with people who hadn't been on the demonstration. In those days you could smoke shisha indoors. You could hardly see for the amount of smoke, and they hadn't been freshly lit. And my friend said to me, I hope he's not watching this, my friend said to me, "How was your demonstration?" I said, "My demonstration? You mean the demonstration of 2 million people to stop Britain and America invading and occupying an Arab country? Is that the demonstration you mean? While you were all sitting here smoking shisha?" See my point? So it is a real problem. And it's our problem. We can't do that much about what the Sun, the dirtiest newspaper in Britain, says, what the Daily Express says, what Fox News says. We can't do that much about that. But we can do everything about ourselves, isn't it? Yes, sir. We can do everything about ourselves. Yes, sir. Yes, brother.
Good evening, Ghaalawi. Again, I just want to follow up with the point that this brother raised. It's about, I think it's a priority as a Muslim. So I think every Muslim is a duty to raise awareness about Islam in the right way. And also, I go to university and I do international politics now. In our lectures or seminars, we discuss many topics and more. Whenever we discussed about Islam, we didn't have that time to teach other people about Islamophobia and the dangers of it. So me and my friend, we decided to set up a society, and we didn't name it Islamic Society because what we were looking was we wanted more Jewish to join us, more Christians, so that we can just teach them a little bit about Islam, and also.
Was it successful, your society?
Yeah, we're still doing it. Now we have. Last week we had one Norwegian girl. She joined our society, and she's loving it now. We're just looking for more people, more and more people to join us, and just to teach them about Islam. And then that's it. Yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful story. It doesn't matter whether the Muslims came from other countries. Maybe they don't think that politics here is important. You'd have to be pretty stupid to think that, because this country is invading and bombing Muslim countries all over the world. So politics in Britain definitely matters. But every Muslim, as a believer, knows that there's a judgment day, and that we'll be asked in the judgment day what we did and what we didn't do. So every Muslim, surely, more than any other, knows that what's the answer going to be. You can't say Iraq was burning, Palestine was imprisoned, Muslims were being attacked, and I did nothing because I come from Pakistan and now I'm living in Britain, and PlayStation and all the other diversions. That's not going to be much of an answer on the judgment day. Who's next? Yes, gentleman in the white polo neck, yeah.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned earlier that Muslims need to get organised, but it's not happening. But from your experience, from your insight, would you say that Muslims are becoming more aware and perhaps are becoming more politicised and are getting involved now, and hopefully that will start something which perhaps hasn't happened in the past?
I would, but that's not entirely working out well. You see, the popular conception in Britain of a Muslim is one of two caricatures, but like all caricatures, there is an essence of truth. Either the Muslim is the guy on Edgware Road who importunes your wife or your sister as she's walking down the street, who's engaging in vile acts with prostitutes, whose cards in Arabic fill the windows of every one of the telephone boxes in London, or the filthy stories that they read of this or that vice or corruption from rich, usually Gulf, Arabs, Muslims. That's one caricature. Or the other caricature is the guy with the backpack who might well be coming to blow you up. Now, we have to challenge both of those paradigms. And one of the things that's happening in Britain is, yes, there's more politicization, but it's the wrong politics. It's the politics of separatism, politics of extremism, the politics of saying, don't vote, don't work with the kuffar, don't imagine that you can win allies, make friends amongst any other section of the population. That's one political trend that's growing. And it's a deeply divisive and dangerous trend. And it's from that trend that 500 British Muslims have gone all the way to Syria, though they don't speak a word of Arabic, have never known anything about Syria, but are ready to kill themselves and kill many others. This is our problem. This is George Galloway. This is كلمة on الميادين television. I'll be right back. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on الميادين television, coming to you from London and speaking about the British Muslims. 2.7 million of them out of a population of 65 million, but an increase of 1 million over just the last 10 years. It's causing quite a tremor amongst right-wing circles in Britain. The question is, what are the Muslims going to do with their 2.7 million? How are they going to get on? How are they going to get better? How are they going to get stronger? How are they going to impose some of their demands on Britain's political agenda? I have a gifted audience of experts here and one or two gifted amateurs like me. Let's see who wants to make the next contribution. Who has the microphone? Yes.
Starting from your last sentence, how can we bring back these people who are, falling in the hand of terrorists? How can we bring them back as a community?
Well, this is a question that has occupied me daily, at least for 12 years, and I mean daily. What I say to Muslims is this, especially young ones. It used to be young males, but now women are also involved in this problem. You are right to be angry. I know that you're angry. You are right to be angry. The best way to get angry is to unite with others who are also angry, who are not Muslims, but who are just as angry as you about the things that make you angry. And by joining hands with others, you can bring some pressure to bear to change that which is making you angry. For example, the Iraq War, we came close to stopping it. The rebellion in Parliament was such, 135 or 39 MPs voted against the war. If we had had 40 or 50 more in our lobby, Britain would not have participated in the Iraq War. And if we'd had not 2 million on the streets, but 5 million, and over, we might have achieved that. There are 60 parliamentary constituencies in Britain where the number of Muslims living in that constituency is greater than the majority enjoyed by the sitting member of Parliament. Do the maths. If all the Muslims decided to vote against the sitting member of Parliament, he would be out. He or she would be out. Now, Can the Muslims possibly do those maths? It would appear so far not. Because those 60 members of parliament, if they thought the Muslims in their constituencies were doing those maths, they'd be supporting our position on Palestine, supporting our position on Kashmir, would be voting consistently against the war. But that doesn't happen because the members of parliament know that the Muslims are not going to vote them out. In fact, Jack Straw, the war criminal, foreign minister of Britain in the run-up to the Iraq war, was carried shoulder high by tens of Muslims in his Blackburn constituency in the election of 2005, when Iraq was still burning, when the bodies lay unburned, unburied, and when Jack Straw had been a major criminal in the war. But the Muslims in Blackburn elected him overwhelmingly back. In fact, they carried him. It's like a scene from the Raj. Really, like a scene from the British Empire. A white man being carried on the shoulder of Muslims 2 years after 1 million Iraqis had been killed by him and by Tony Blair. It was one of the most devastating scenes I ever saw in my entire life. And there are many others. There's a man called Mike Gapes, Member of Parliament in Ilford on the outskirts of London. He's a total, unrepentant, boastful Zionist. He's Israel's strongest supporter in Parliament. But most of his voters are Muslims. What kind of consciousness is this? If the Muslims could agree to support one candidate, any candidate other than him, he'd be out. But he knows that he can act with impunity because he knows the Muslims will not vote him out. That's why.
So why they're voting for him?
Because they will not unite. Some are telling you voting is haram. These takfiri lunatics. Some, like the colonial mentality that Irfan is talking about, some are colluding and collaborating with the Khawaja. Yes, please, yes, please. 3 bags full, sir. Anything you want to give me, I'll take it.
They feel subservient.
Yes. But as Bob Marley said, never mind Malcolm X, though Malcolm X is instructive in this, as Bob Marley said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but yourself can free your mind. The Muslims have to free their minds and emancipate themselves from mental slavery. I'm sorry, I'm getting upset now. Who's next? Yes?
Hi, I'm 12 years old and I wanted to say that...
You're 12 years old, did you say?
Yeah.
MashaAllah, how wonderful. No, it's okay.
I wanted to say that I think Shias and Sunnis should unite together to really show the true image of Islam. And I get bullied in school for being Shia by Sunnis, and it's really sad because I think we should unite and to show the non-Muslims the true Islam and to say that these people like ISIS aren't right and they're not really Islamic jihadists, or I don't know, the true Muslims.
Wallah, out of the mouths of babes. Some are takfiri lunatics saying you shouldn't be involved in British politics, you shouldn't have friends from the kuffar, you shouldn't be working with the kuffar. Others are saying 3 bags full, sir, anything I can do for you, can I carry you on my shoulder? Others are bullying a little girl because she's a Muslim of a different kind from them. There's only one God. There's only one Quran. That's the fact. That's the truth. Imagine. They're bullying this little girl because she's a Shiite. Whilst the Americans and the British are bombing and killing anybody indiscriminately anywhere that they like. Instead of fighting the power, they're fighting this little girl. Wallah, Islam is perfect, but the Muslims are very far from perfect. Yes, madam.
Just saying, my grandson is 5, is first year in school, and he's getting comments like, "Oh, you're Muslim, I hate Muslims, why are you a Muslim?" You know, and this is just, for me, so upsetting. And I was going to speak to the teacher about this, because surely the parents, he's only hearing this. Pardon?
I did speak to the teacher, and she said that she would speak to the little boy in an appropriate way, obviously, but it made me upset because he's only 5, and
already talking about it's okay. It's okay. Yeah, she's very, very upset about this, you know, but it's the parents, isn't it? Because he's only hearing and repeating what his parents have said, surely. Yeah. Undoubtedly.
Well, my son goes to a school where 80% of the children are Muslim. So that problem doesn't arise from him. In fact, although he's only half white, he's the only white boy in the class. But that's our good luck. Not everybody has that good luck. But you must talk to the teacher in the strongest possible terms, because this is illegal what the boy is saying. And undoubtedly, he's saying it because he heard it at home, undoubtedly. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Hi, my name's Adam. What are your predictions for the next general election, and what do you think the future government can do to help restore a sense of security amongst us Muslims? You know, protecting us from, you know, protecting little children from like hateful comments, bullying, also grown-ups from, you know, discrimination.
Well, the best thing you could do is make me the Prime Minister, but that's not going to happen. Thank you. You're too kind. That's not going to happen. Nothing much is going to change in this regard in relation to the next general election. If the Conservative Party gets back in, if David Cameron is re-elected, especially if the United Kingdom Independence Party gets a number of members of Parliament, things will get worse. Not least because they are committed to having a referendum on Britain leaving the European Union in 2017. So it's going to be quite a difficult couple of years when the country is being pumped full of xenophobic, chauvinistic, ultra-nationalistic propaganda. That will not per se be against Muslims, but Muslims will be also caught up as victims in that atmosphere. That's one of the reasons, it's not the only one, why I'm hoping for a Labour victory in the general election. Obviously, I hope people will vote for my own party, Respect, where we can stand, but we can't stand everywhere, or even actually in most places. I hope Labour is elected, because Labour is less bad than the Conservatives and more pressurable by us than the Conservatives will be. However, the Labour Party is led by Ed Miliband, who told the Jewish community through their community newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, "I am a Zionist." Ed, "I am a Zionist," Miliband. He became thus the only Labour leader in all history to define himself openly and avowedly as a Zionist. The others largely were Zionists, but they didn't dream actually to say it, to speak it out in quotation marks. But notwithstanding that, any Labour government is going to be better than any Conservative government. Any Muslim voting Conservative, even worse, voting UKIP, and there's a UKIP candidate against me whose name is Muhammad Hari Bhutta. UKIP wants immigrants out of the country, and he's standing as a candidate for them. And his name's Muhammad, and he's standing against me. Me. Now, any Muslim who votes for UKIP or for the Conservatives is a turkey voting for an early Christmas. Yes, sir.
It's just all I try to say, you know, what we should do between the Muslim, we more trust each other, you know. This is because all I hear, they send the lorry of the blood to the Palestine, and they say we don't use this blood because this blood from the Shia people, and they burn it, which one I saw in the YouTube. And they say this is the haram, even, you know, this is, we not using for our, that's why.
Well, look, all the Palestinians in Gaza, apart from a very small Christian community, all of the Palestinians in Gaza are Sunni Muslims. But the only people, the only countries which helped the Palestinians under the attack in Gaza were Shia. And I can't believe that any Palestinian who knew that, which is everybody in Gaza, could possibly say such a thing about blood. But sectarianism exists. It's being deliberately fostered. Indeed, there are states in the Arab world who have a vested interest in making that division bigger, deeper, wider all the time, because it keeps them in power. Saudi Arabia, the regime in Saudi Arabia is only in power because it fosters this kind of fanatic extremism based on sectarian hatred. Sectarian hatred against the Shia minority in their own country, trying to make as big a coalition as possible of people who hate Shiites in other countries, and thus they stay in power. But in their hearts, I believe that the Palestinian people know who helped them. They know who helped them with weapons. They know who helped them in many other ways. And I don't believe that sectarianism amongst Palestinian people is a significant issue. Certainly not by comparison with some other Arab countries. There'll be much more of this after the break. You're watching Kaliма with me, George Galloway, on Al-Miadin television coming from London. We're talking about British Muslims. And we have quite a few British Muslims here in the audience, and a lot of very wise things they've got to say. Let's take the gentleman in the middle there. Yes, sir?
In light of the fact there's a lot of talk about what's going on in society and a lot of schisms, and people are talking about what's going on and what's the answer. And also in light of the fact that Muslims see religion as their answer, and they're not necessarily political. What do you see as the answer to waking them up to the necessities of being political?
Well, I'm myself convinced that religion and politics are inextricably linked. For example, I gave the obvious one. If Muslims don't vote, the other people vote, and they vote someone that they want rather than the person the Muslims wanted or should have wanted. So instead of Ken Livingstone as London Mayor, you get Boris Johnson as London Mayor. Ken Livingstone did a lot of things for the Muslims. Boris Johnson has done nothing for the Muslims. So there, it's simple, logical, rational self-interest that you should vote for people that are going to work for you. Why does every American president, even Barack Obama, have to discover a long-lost Irish relative in order to get elected? It's not because they love Ireland, its music, or its potatoes, though all are wonderful. It's because there are 30 million Irish Americans who won't vote for you unless you offer them support. If you offer them support for Irish reunification, independence from Britain, and so on. It's simple. So the American politicians have to, if they want the votes of the 30 million Irish Americans. Why don't 2.7 British Muslims say, if you want our vote, here are a list of things that you're going to have to promise to do for us? But that doesn't happen. My second point, I've already made. It's more of a philosophical one. I am utterly convinced, it's a matter of faith, that on the Judgment Day, God will be more interested in what I did on this or that issue to defend the Muslims, their lives, their dignity, their honor, their lands, than whether my beard is long enough. It's a question of form and content. Some Muslims are obsessed by form, but imagine that God is unconcerned on the Judgment Day with content. I just don't see it that way. The lady at the back.
Hi, George. My question to you is, do you think that there is a direct correlation with the lack of unity of the Muslim community in the UK due to the fact that there is a lack of unity in the Muslim world, specifically Arab countries?
I do, but there's less of an excuse for it here. If you're living in an Arab country under a dictatorship, there's not much you can do to influence what that dictatorship does. But if you're living in Britain, there's absolutely no one who can force you to hate a Shiite, or to force a Shiite to hate a Sunni, or to force any Muslim to carry jack straw on their shoulder, because this is a free country compared to the Arab dictatorships. Nobody can tell you how to vote. Nobody can tell you who to put on your shoulder. Nobody can tell you who to hate. And if you could only feel your power, you'd be surprised at how the politicians would come running for you. You see, in a country like this, it's not you who needs the politician, it's the politician who needs you. I've already said more than 60, it's 61 to be precise, 61 MPs could be voted out just by the Muslims changing their vote and voting against that MP. If the MPs knew that you might do that, then everything would be very different. I give an example again from East London. I won a seat in East London in Bethnal Green and Bow in 2005. I defeated a very important, powerful, prominent Labour MP who was one of Tony Blair's babes, they used to call them. Even though she represented an area where the vast majority of voters were against the war on Iraq, she voted for the war on Iraq. Indeed, she campaigned for the war on Iraq because she thought the people would vote her in anyway. Well, I came along, and guess what? They voted her out. But there's only one of me. I can't make, well, I'm trying, mashallah, I have many children, but it will be some time before they will be able to be in the political arena. And when I'm not there, people support the warmonger. People support the MP who actually acts directly against their own interest. And that's just foolishness in the extreme. Yes, gentleman in the blue shirt at the back. Yes.
Hi, George. I just wanted to ask you, how do you think schools can change the way they deal with Islamophobia, and how they can change their, say, history courses to teach youths about, not just schools, but educational systems, to teach their youths about British history rather than teaching them about American racism in the 1960s?
Well, that's a good point. The British are keen to teach their children about racism in the United States as late as the late 1960s, but they're less likely to teach them about the fact that when Britain arrived in Bengal, it was the richest place in the world, and when Britain left Bengal, it was the poorest place in the world, and you don't have to be Einstein to work out what happened in between. Britain stole everything that they could possibly carry from Bengal. But that's not the history that gets taught here in Britain. We're not taught about the famine in India. We're not taught about the massacre at Amritsar, where British soldiers massacred a huge number of the local Indian population. So this is a direct function of politics. Politicians run the schools. The headmaster has the job of implementing it, but it's the politicians who decide the values that are going to be inculcated in the young people in these schools. And the problem is that the values of the politicians are wrong. Thereby, we come back to politics. I know you probably think I'm a political junkie of some kind, but politics is connected to all these things. Whether you have schools at all is a political matter. Whether you have to pay for them or they're free is a political matter. What is taught in those schools is a political matter. What values are imparted in these schools? Yes, sir.
So I just want to add something following on from what, on top of that, basically. When it comes to history, what I've actually found is, even like for our primary school children, our children are being taught about, you know, a question could be, oh, choose a famous Victorian person. I mean, how many of us would actually consider even choosing Abdullah Quillam, who was seen as Sheikh al-Islam Britannia back in Victorian Britain? How many of us have actually, you know, learnt about his life, anything like that? And that's kind of absent even from the adult generation as well. So if you're actually asking even for the children, I mean, even if you don't want the syllabus to change, you could actually twig it so it can actually cater for your children as well.
Very good point. Who's next?
Just to change the direction of the conversation for a moment, I certainly wasn't aware that Muslims had been in the UK for 100 years or so, and I certainly am not aware of Muslim achievements. So I'd be interested to know exactly what Muslims in the UK have achieved, particularly in the context when Muslims are being told that your values aren't compatible with British values. So I think I'd be interested to know exactly what we have achieved and what we've contributed.
Well, in the field of medicine, there are uncountable numbers of Muslim doctors. That much I know. I've dealt with many of them in one way or another. In my own city in Bradford, where I now represent, there's an association of Muslim professionals, AMP, and I regularly go to their events. And when I go, it's filled with lawyers, with lecturers, with physicians, with dentists, with people who have achieved in the professional field really great things. So the Muslims have many achievers in Britain, but most Muslims are not achievers. As I said earlier, most of the Muslims are poor. Most of them are immigrants, poor, living in the inner city, more likely to be jobless, and their women very much more likely to be jobless, and they're elderly, and especially their elderly women, much more likely to suffer from poor health. So there's a very, very long distance to go. Now, partly that reflects the nature of the immigration in the first place, and a difference between Britain and the United States. For example, in the United States, the Kashmiri population is really very rich and very, very successful, because the best educated and wealthiest Kashmiris emigrated to the United States. The poorest and least educated Kashmiris immigrated to Britain. So you're starting off behind the starting line. And it's inevitable that it will take longer for that to work its way through, as long as we're going in the right direction. And that's the point. Okay, last couple of contributions. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Do you think that, you know, Muslims holding MPs up on their shoulders, and not knowing what's going on, do you think that's partly because of the lack of political education? Yeah.
I really don't. In fact, Pakistanis and Bengalis are amongst the most political people on earth. They discuss politics all the time. Who's more political than an Arab? The man in the Khan Khalili market in Fishawi Street, who's sweeping Fishawi Street in Cairo, he's a politician. He could be in the cabinet in Britain. He knows everything about politics. Even under the dictatorship, he knew everything about politics. I don't think that Muslims don't understand politics. And it's not that they didn't know about Jack Straw. We put up a candidate against him, a former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who Jack Straw sacked for raising the question of human rights in Uzbekistan. So, our candidate was a former ambassador, sacked for defending the Muslim people of Uzbekistan, one of the leaders of the anti-war movement. He got 4,000 votes. Jack Straw got 25,000 and carried shoulder high. Now, I have to stress to you, I'm talking about 2005. I'm talking about when the fighting in Iraq was still going on. I'm talking about when the dead, some of them, still lay unburied, where the buildings destroyed hadn't even begun to be repaired. Jack Straw, next to Tony Blair, was the #2 war criminal. How do you account for that? Irfan, how do you account for it?
I think it's that Malcolm X spoke about between, I mean, I don't know if it's still a politically correct to say, but the house Negro and the slave and the field Negro, the one who is next to the master all the time, who is telling the others how they should live, how they should behave, and is implementing their policies on everybody. And when that master became ill, you know, the one that was in the house said to him, "It's not you that's ill, master, it's us that's ill." When the house began to burn down, he said, "It's our house that's burning down, it's not your house." So it's still this mentality amongst some people where petty politics, this system of engagement, is based around personal interests and not the wider interests. And I'm optimistic because I think it's changing now. And you know, I think you're the proof of that. Wherever you go and stand, people will elect you. When there is an alternative, people will choose it. But it's about providing that. It's about engaging people to get to that stage, and that's something we have to work on.
Well, I told you he was a clever young boy, didn't I? He's only 17, and he's one of the great hopes. Well, Irfan has identified a really fundamental point: personal interest as opposed to the interests of the Ummah. Now, Muslims believe in an Ummah, but they don't practice it. That's the truth of the matter. When I was in Gaza, right after Operation Cast Lead, I met a young girl standing in the ruins of her house. She had just lost her mother, her father, and all of her brothers, all of them. She was an orphan. She had been at the house of her grandmother when the Israeli missile destroyed her house and wiped out her entire family. And I met her standing in the rubble, not organized, by chance. You know what she asked me? Where is this Ummah that they teach us about in school? Where is this Ummah? Why did they leave us alone? Why did they leave us alone to face all of this? What did we do wrong to be left alone to face all of this? I had no answer for her. If any of you got the answer, there is no answer. Is there an Ummah or is there not? Is Islam a religion that believes in community, in a people, or not? Or are they like the house servants that Irfan just described, who for some crumbs off the table of the master are ready to betray the interests of the others out there working in the fields? Isn't that the big question here? Do we really believe? Do you really believe you're my brother? Do you care only for your own children or for my children also? Are we all God's children? Are we all brothers and sisters? Do we believe in me and now, or in us and always? That's the big question. And it's a question that religious believers, more than anybody else, must know the answer to. We must know the answer that will be expected. on the judgment day, or we don't actually really believe at all. Because if we believe there's a judgment day, we must believe that we will be judged on what we did and what we didn't do in human society, and especially amongst the Muslims. Did the Prophet not teach this? Do people not know it? Does the Quran not say it in the words of the Almighty Himself? Everybody here watching knows the answer to these questions. But the bigger question is when they're going to implement the answers that they know to be true. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra for Al Miadeen Television in London.